Hi, welcome. My name is Dale McCluskey. And on this video, I'm going to be discussing the context of balance called balanced dog training and answering the question as it relates to defining the line. Where's the line in the sand, so to speak, as it relates to what represents balanced dog training and what represents what balanced dog trainers define as pure positive training? Where is that line in the sand? However, I'm going to be looking through a different lens. I'm going to be looking through the relational lens as it relates to defining this line. And some of the other things I'm going to be talking about in this video is discussing the issue about owners' expectations as it relates to this learning-based narrative, understanding the culture of thinking and why it is that things are the way that they are currently in the dog training world. I'm also going to be discussing the issue of fail rates. Okay, what are the fail rates as you start to go down this spectrum and move the line, so to speak, away from defining what training really represents as a relational changing process versus a type of learning-based exercise. How is it that the risk levels will elevate and the elevation levels as you go further down this line. The other issue you've got to talk about is the issue about self-audit, about trainers who can get away with saying and doing certain things through social media and promoting this ideology and this learning narrative, selling it as is onto the public, and why they get away with that and why people buy into that. And the real overreaching issue as to the question of is this actually science-based? Okay, within this learning narrative, the way that does it hold up to challenge, and can it be reconciled? And that's the other issue to look at. So here, what you're starting off here with defining the line, what you're looking at here is a type of a graph. Again, you can check out my other videos. I refer to a spectrum here, and so this takes on a type of spectrum here, similar to what I've done prior, in terms of moving the line down further away from the process. But here, what I've added in here is kind of grouping this in a little bit, so people get a sense of understanding when people call themselves a balanced dog trainer. What does that represent? What does that really encompass? And what you'll find when you go into and investigate this term and trying to get a definition as to what does that incorporate, you'll see everything in the mix and everything in between, including remote trainers that pivot off or use remote and prong collars. You're going to see trainers who will use food, balanced dog trainers that will use clickers, and trainers that will incorporate in a leadership ideology that promote leadership, and they'll use what's called corrections as well. Okay, so they'll use what they define as corrections within their approach. And here's the thing to understand: when you look at the defining the difference between what is called a balanced dog trainer and what balanced dog trainers call pure positive trainers, what you'll see, some of the kind of identifiers to kind of define the two groups, you'll commonly hear the word quadrants being used. And quadrants works within this learning narrative, the parameters of the learning narrative, by way of this interpretive script, okay, with rewarding a dog for certain behaviors. And this issue about positive and negative, okay, how that frames up in terms of behavioral change. And so what you'll hear, the issue about negative punishment, positive punishment. But here's the thing to really understand in terms of the real problem, but not just that, but defining within the parameters of quadrants. You'll hear, balanced dog trainers say, well, pure positive trainers is that group that will use only one quadrant or two quadrants, and basically they don't use any sort of punishment-based, negative-based, removing something from the dog, or using a corrective influence, okay, within that narrative. And so the kind of defining line there for balanced dog trainers is when they look at establishing kind of this kind of subgrouping. Okay, they look at those trainers who are pure positive. Okay, they just believe that you don't have to use any sort of adversive methodology, any sort of influence by way of a correction, and the picture that is painted is therefore somehow problematic. But here is the problem when it comes to balanced dog trainers, is there's lack of specifics. Okay, other than trying to promote that, okay, leadership is needed, and that, by way of that, using certain devices is the way to go, and using corrections is needed, having a sense of that as well. There's no real specifics as to why it is that picture is a problem. Okay, other than to say sometimes what they'll put out as part of their narrative is, well, honestly, there is more than one way to train a dog, but this is the better way, and vice versa. You'll hear these so-called pure positive trainers say, well, it appears as though corrections and all that work, but you're suppressing the dog, that you're instilling fear in the dog. The dog's only doing it because it fears the person. So they put that narrative out. So these narratives kind of back and forth. And so what you'll see is these arguments in this debate between so-called balanced dog trainers and pure positive trainers really results in a type of standoff. You don't really get any sort of resolution as to who's wrong and who's right. And this is why, again, this has been going on for a long time, and this is why this divisiveness has escalated year over year, this type of hostility between these groups. But again, if you really pay attention to get some sort of definitive answer as to what sets this group apart, you can't. And the reason that you can't is because they all work within the parameters of approaching training as a type of learning-based exercise. So what I do here is I call out the learning narrative itself as the real problem, because trainers who invest into this narrative, who come into agreement with this narrative, they take the position that response represents a like-minded state through how the picture is painted, through incentivizing the dog to respond in certain ways. And so they are making this flawed assumption that good things are happening just because the dog does certain things a certain way based on their narrative. Again, that assumption is inherently flawed, okay, based on how a dog's decision-making process is governed relationally. So the important thing to really note here is that this is why, again, if you look at this kind of back and forth and trying to get some sort of definitive line as to what even represents balanced dog training, it's merely an exercise in futility. But to get somewhat of a sense of how they kind of define it is, once you get into this anti-dominance message, okay, with these trainers who promote training as a full-blown learning-based exercise, and typically you'll be the ones who pivot heavily off food, off clickers, and carry along with it is this type of anti-adversive, anti-dominance message. Then you're getting into this thing about pure positive, what would be referred to as pure positive, okay, by way of how balanced dog trainers, how they define it. But here's the problem here, and if you really pay attention to why it is that right now there's device bans happening with, say, remote and prong collars, and the bans are spreading everywhere, it's because of the confusion, okay? This is why you see these trainers who pivot heavily off these devices, trying to justify why they're using these devices, trying to justify the uses of these devices. This anti kind of dominance group, this this pure positive group, what they're doing is they're taking advantage of the gaps, okay, in lack of specifics as to what's really happening, okay? So they're calling out these trainers to say, listen, we show very clearly that you don't need to use these devices. And because many of these people are academics, they have the ears of certain legislative people, those in power, that will oftentimes come into agreement with it and then remove these collars. And again, the point is, then more dogs take the hit. So, but this whole back and forth, understand the underlying overreaching problem is really is found within this narrative itself. Okay, just understand this is the real problem. Now, the issue here too of talk about defining the line. So the line really is somewhere in here, but understand if you're on this spectrum and you're working within this learning narrative, if you've invested in this learning narrative, you're going to have a problem, guaranteed. Okay, and you're not going to have a sense of it because of how the picture sets up. Okay, when the dog owner is currently experiencing ongoing behavioral issues and problems with their dog, its behavior issues are a result of a manifestation of control issues. Okay, so when you step into this type of learning narrative, this learning narrative is not helpful because it shifts the focus away from how change is defined in and through the person. Okay, how it frames up. And so what it does is it kind of stalls the person out. Okay, it'll again launch right into this response-based alignment. Okay, and even balanced dog trainers do this. They follow this same type of, they come into agreement with this same type of interpretive narrative, and it's very problematic. Now again, in my last video, I do show that yes, by incorporating certain things including corrective influence, you're going to be better than this group. Okay, your fail rate's going to be lower, but you're still going to have a problem because you've come into agreement with this narrative, which is a problem in itself. Okay, just understand that. Now, here's the thing to understand when I talk about corrective influence. I make the distinction between corrective and relational influence by way of the methodology being specific in the changing process. Okay, this is a really important point. So, therefore, balanced dog trainers who follow that corrections are needed, they follow a reactive path. Okay, it's reactive, not proactive. Okay, with how they approach, bringing influence online at certain points of their, of that scripting process. Whereas approaching training is a relational changing process, the type of influence is relational. Okay, so therefore it's part of the methodology. And there's depth to it, which means that it's proactive, which means that you're approaching training at a deeper level in terms of how influence manifests, how it comes online to create change. Whereas here, you're into a reactive, narrative, and you're still invested in this learning narrative, which again, part of the equation, and again, it sets up a problem for people. Because again, it's this whole issue about this type of assumption that's made without truly understanding how the process needs to be identified. Okay, you have to approach it differently to make sure that relational change is really happening, and you're not going to be deceived by dogs going through the motions and assuming certain things, which is very typical. Okay, it's very common, especially down at this level. Okay, but again, it's really getting this. Now, here's the other thing about prong and remote collars. I talk about this on my other videos, is understanding the issue about, these control issues. Okay, what the best devices to use are. When you start to, employ certain devices such as a prong collar, yes, you might get a better walk. Okay, dog, you might get a better physical position, dog responding. However, in terms of relational change, you have to be very careful to understand that oftentimes dogs, yes, they'll respond to a certain device because of what the device represents, but doesn't mean it's going to align properly when it comes to promoting change properly in and through the person themselves. The dog's just going to respond to that collar. This is why when you see a lot of trainers pivoting off these collars, yes, it's a very easy way to kind of go, or it'll feel that way. Okay, it's kind of like I call it a drive-through type of mentality, but then you can never get these collars off these dogs because the level of change that's happening is not deep enough. Okay, for these to become merely a means to an end, not a end unto themselves, and then you can't get these collars removed, and the person feels like once the collar comes off, the dog is back in control. Okay, this is very common. But again, this is kind of like the mentality With again, the example I use is like for me to talk about depth and why you want to take, remove or not pivot off these collars. It'd be like trying to talk to somebody like a cashier, very dependent on a cash register, who's lost the ability to do basic math when the power goes out. And if you've ever been in that situation, you'll understand what I'm talking about. And you're standing there and they can't add because they've become so focused on a device that they've kind of regressed in their basic math skills. And so it's the same thing happening with a lot of trainers, is that they become so entrenched in these devices. I talk about stripping everything away so that you can get a sense of what's happening beyond, with this picture and this narrative. They simply can't get it. Okay, and then this is why these device bans start happening. These trainers are going into a panic state because, again, the point I make is a lot of these trainers will actually probably walk away from the dog training business rather than self-audit and really get to the depth of what's happening. But that's what needs to happen in terms of fixing the big picture, when people understand that there's these problems layer up. And this is why I can talk the way I'm talking, because I years ago I stripped everything down and really undertook to figure this stuff out as to, okay, what's going on here? There's something not lining up. I didn't just embrace or dovetail into a ready-made ideology and just started marketing it and pushing it out there. I undertook to figure this stuff out, and that's why I can say the things I'm saying. Now here, the issue about fail rates. Okay, and it's the same rule applies here. As you go down this spectrum, the further you take it from what defining the process as what it is, therefore the fail rates are going to increase. Okay, the potential fail rates. And when I talk about fail rates, what I'm talking about is these trainers not even have the sense that people are failing as these dogs are moving around, because they're totally invested in that appearance-based narrative. They're just saying, well, if it looks good and it feels good, it must be good. And that's kind of like the standard we're at right now. And so here, again, you can start getting down into this level. You're looking at a 70 to 80% fail rate down here for dog owners stepping into a process with ongoing problems. Just want people to understand that. And then the other issue is this issue about expectations, okay, how it is that a fail rate like that could possibly exist, and then these trainers get away with it. It's because of how people think. Okay, the dog owners themselves will come into agreement with this, with failure, based on the fact of why they went and are leaning towards this ideology in the first place. Okay, all the dominoes fall the same way. I want people to understand that. So people will accept certain things based on how they think. This is why you go into these discussion forums, you'll see a lot of these people who come into agreement with this ideology who aren't even trainers, trying to go after even balanced dog trainers who, don't, or challenge, don't conform to this level of promoting the ideology this way. Okay, so again, you get a major problem. So the issue about getting away with why this has become such a problem in the dog training world, it's because of what society has embraced. People certain people getting popular based on where society's at. Okay, but the issue about the disconnect between, I showed you look at the millions of dogs being destroyed every year. Why is the shelters are full to capacity? And even recent articles that came out asking questions why it is that the number of dog bites has increased beyond the breed-specific bans. So the breed-specific bans have come into place because of these. Again, I encourage you to go watch my other video. I talk about this on this need spectrum video, but how these certain breeds will expose the underbelly of this ideology. So these breed-specific bans have taken effect, but now you have dog bites incidents increasing beyond the breed-specific bans, and the media is asking questions as to why is that happening. Okay, that's happening because of the popularity of this learning narrative, the culture of thinking, okay, what's become very popular, and where we're at. So even by default, okay, this learning narrative is a problem because of, again, owners' expectations of getting empowering people, but empowering dog owners in the wrong way. Not about promoting right relationship, not promoting the process properly to make sure relational change happens. Even balanced dog trainers are guilty of doing this, because merely the fact that have come into agreement with this learning narrative, okay, it sets up unrealistic expectations for dog owners. Okay, they're going to get something out of the deal, and when you're considering the fact that many of these owners have a long ways to go, they're in a major deficit by way of how they're thinking. They have to reconcile their thinking processes. This learning narrative doesn't promote change like that, the level of change, okay, because it's inherently, leans towards a certain way of thinking, making the owner feel good about the process. I want to reward my dog. I want to do all these things, right? And, it's all about how people think. So it's a major, major problem, just the fact that people have aligned with it. Now, here's the other thing. Again, I call it this relational wild card, but trainers are, get very confused as to why it is that they can perhaps get away with incorporating a certain level of this narrative into their approach. The dogs they personally handle, relational change happens, and I'm not disputing that at all, based on how certain people think, like myself. But the problem here is not looking beyond themselves at the people that are coming to them for help to see what the real problem is by way of how this narrative impacts those people. Okay, these trainers totally self-focused. So again, there is an overriding agent, and that's the person themselves. But typically, if you look at the majority, you're going to find that although, you might get away with it by incorporating a level of this into your narrative, the people that are coming to you aren't going to be so fortunate, and you're not even going to know that they're failing, okay? Because of, again, you really consider what I'm saying about how appearances are very deceptive to this narrative. Dogs are responding around, and you're making assumptions, and you're not even approaching the process properly to begin with. You've aligned yourself with this out of the starting gate thing with getting the dog to motivate the dog to move around certain ways. And here's the real kind of depth of this. Okay, you can take food out of the equation, but based on the fact that the dog's already in control itself becomes a motivating agent through that owner, okay, without this being in the equation. Just the fact the dog sees that person as a toll booth, and control itself will branch off that person, then control becomes its own motivating agent. So you can see here why you got a tremendous problem here when you start to look at motivating the dog to respond certain ways, and you're embracing this as the way to go. It's inherently flawed by way of how the picture sets up, just by going by response and incorporating certain things into it. You have to remove this from the equation. That's the point. So the issue about again, anticipated fail rates. I mentioned that you're looking at 70 or 80% up here. Down here, you're looking at 40%, 30%, and this is all kind of in flux here, but you can kind of intentionally kind of track this, what the fail rates would be. But again, there's this question, science of dog training. Is this science? Absolutely not. This is not. This does not hold hands with the truth. There's half truth in this narrative. I talk about this thing with related to the personality type of the person, the overriding factor of that. But even you get these balanced dog trainers, it's incredible to me. They get this thing about the quadrants and being more scientific is how they'll define using 4 quadrants instead of 2. Absolutely not. I mean, that is the problem, is this learning narrative itself. Just because you work off of 4 quadrants and not 2, it does not allow you to get away from the problem inherent within that narrative, because you're still working within the parameters of it. You've aligned yourself with it. So if you're looking at defining yourself differently between what you're doing out of the starting gate and what they're doing by way of this response alignment through response and the dog's assumptions made in the dog's state of mind, you're doing the same thing. Okay, you're doing the exact same thing. So again, I would encourage anyone looking for answers. If you're if you're a dog owner I would encourage you to really pay attention to what I'm showing here. This comes off very many of these trainers would be are going to be highly offended at this information, because understand something, they've crossed lines. Okay, they've done something that I never did. Years ago when I saw there's a problem, because this is an ethical thing here too. You talk about morals and ethics issue here. So it really comes down to that. It goes beyond just this narrative. It's about what these trainers have chosen to do. And now this information's out there. And ask yourself the question, this information staring them in the face right now, what's the ethical thing to do? Well, it would be to consider everything I'm saying and put it to the test. Because everything I'm saying is very transparent. You can put it to the test. You can figure this out. You can put it to the test. But so when trainers are presented with this information, the majority will not come into agreement with it. Because here's the thing to understand, is they have too much to lose. Now, I'm just putting this information out for at a acceptance and rejection level. Okay, there's no kind of getting along here. There's no kind of wiggle room. In fact, based on this narrative, how trainers have embraced it, it really puts them into a really bad position, because it really brings almost everything they've done down to foolishness. I mean, if you really look at just how devastating this is to the dog training world, that's what it does. But it is what it is. I'm pointing towards the problem here. I'm showing it. And the fault really lies in these trainers who have failed at all levels to face off on the real issue. This is what it's come down to. But if you look at the massive problems in the dog training world and really get a sense of just how big they are, you'll see that this is the problem. But again, when you consider the fact that 99% of all dog trainers have come into agreement with this narrative, you can see where this steps on just about everybody's toes. But again, if you're a dog owner, okay, really caring about your dog, I would really encourage you to pay attention to this information. If you're looking for help with your dog and you're rolling the dice within the parameters of this learning narrative, whether it's a balanced dog trainer or not, and things don't go as planned, guess what's going to happen? They're going to shift the blame onto something other than themselves. In this narrative, the blame's going to fall squarely on your dog's shoulders or on your shoulders. Okay, I just want you to understand that. Or if this is disconnected somehow, from the training environment to, the home environment and behavior issues that you're experiencing, again, understand that you're going to take the hit. Okay, but again, I'm putting this information out there for you. Now, again, if you're looking for answers, check out my website. I have lots of great information. I'm putting out lots of videos, free videos, breaking this stuff down for people, helping people understand, the process. And I just don't talk about the problem, okay? I offer the solution. So the methodology I develop is specific to change. I have lots of method videos. Okay, you'll see them on my website, on my YouTube channel. Lots of method videos. I show the actual method, how to approach the training process, and I would encourage you to check them out. Okay, it's the right path to take. Stay away from this learning narrative. I know this is kind of like the popular thing right now in the dog training world, but again, if you look at all the problems that are happening in the dog training world, they are all symptomatic. Okay, there's no accidents. There's no coincidences. Everything that's happening makes complete sense once you start to look through the relational lens. So, thanks for watching.